Hey, my name is Spencer and I'm a lifelong disciple of Jesus Christ. And today we're going to be diving into 4 books of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or as they're otherwise known, the 4 Gospels. And as we break them down, my hopes is that it will show you how to break down and digest a book and look at it in the way that it fits into the greater story and the greater narrative of Scripture, and how one book fits in and connects and relates to the other books around it. So here are the 4 Gospels like you've never seen them. So we have the 4 Gospels. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the reason they're called the Gospels is because each one of these books tells the story of Jesus Christ. They tell the story of His life, they tell the story of His death, and they tell the story of His resurrection. And so what makes each of these books unique is that each of them was written from a specific viewpoint for a specific purpose. Each one of the writers was writing their books very intentionally to present Jesus in a very specific way in order to convince their specific target audience that Jesus Christ was, in fact, the Messiah. So first up, we have the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. And Matthew, he was a tax collector and he was one of the original 12 disciples. Matthew is a Jew and he's writing his book to Jews. The Jewish people are the target audience of Matthew's book. He's trying to present Jesus in 2 different ways. He's trying to present Jesus as a king and as the promised Messiah. And so in order to present Jesus as not just an ordinary man, but really the rightful king of Israel, he begins to outline Jesus' lineage and trace it, but he's very specific in the way that he traces it. He traces it and accents the lineage of King David through the lineage of Jesus Christ. And he's wanting to make a connection in the mind of his reader between King David, the greatest king Israel ever had, and Jesus Christ, and that Jesus Christ is the offspring of David. Matthew is trying to present Jesus as not just an ordinary man, but he was in fact the Messiah that all the law and the prophets have been prophesying and speaking of that was coming. That he was the promised Messiah, that he was in fact the Christ. So in order to do this, there over and over and over, you'll find in the book of Matthew that it'll say, Jesus went and did this, so that it might be fulfilled when the prophet said this. Or you'll find that Jesus healed this person. Why? Matthew will say, so that it might be fulfilled by the Old Testament prophet when the prophet said this. And you'll find over and over and over again that Jesus is doing things so that it might be fulfilled in the Old Testament that He is in fact the Messiah. Because Matthew's wanting to make that connection in the mind of every one of his readers that Jesus is the one the prophets talked about. He is the one who fulfilled all the prophecies of the Old Testament. But Jesus is presented as a king, and over and over you'll find Jesus talking about the subject of the kingdom or the kingdom of heaven. Over 55 times in the book of Matthew, Jesus makes reference to the kingdom. He talks about the kingdom coming, or Him coming to reveal the kingdom, or He tells a parable and says, the kingdom is like unto this parable, because Matthew's wanting to present Jesus as a ruler of a kingdom. Not necessarily an earthly kingdom, but a spiritual kingdom. Something else you find in the book of Matthew is there's lots of teaching by Jesus and there's lots of preaching by Jesus. You'll find the longest sermon of Jesus, what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. That's going to be found in the book of Matthew. You'll find the Beatitudes and you'll find the bulk majority of the parables that Jesus taught in the book of Matthew. And so He's presented as a wise teacher, He's presented as a kingly figure, and He's presented as the promised Messiah. And there's a big emphasis in the book of Matthew put on all the things that Jesus said. So that is the book of Matthew. Matthew is a Jewish individual writing to the Jewish people in order to present Jesus as the promised Messiah. Next up, we have the book of Mark. And the book of Mark is a unique book in the fact that it's the smallest or the shortest of the 4 Gospels. All right, now we believe that this is John Mark. And John Mark was a Jew, and he was the cousin of Barnabas. and he was a confidant in Peter, and he even accompanied Apostle Paul on a missionary journey. It's believed that John Mark was a young man living in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' ministry, and he was able to be there and to witness firsthand the accounts of Jesus. But when John Mark writes his gospel, he's writing it in a different way because he's not writing his book to the target audience of the Jewish people. He's writing his book to the target audience of the Romans. And at the time that Jesus Christ was alive in the city of Rome, 50% of the people were either a slave or a slave owner. And the culture of the Romans was dominated with a military mindset. And so this is very key in the way that John Mark is writing his gospel. He knows he's writing his gospels to either slaves or slave owners. And so he presents Jesus in a very strategic way. He presents Jesus as a servant. The majority of the book of Mark consists of miracles that Jesus did. And he's being presented as a man of action. He's always going here or going there, and he's always giving commandments. He's telling somebody to go here or to go there. And what separates the book of Mark from the book of Matthew is that Matthew put a lot of emphasis on what Jesus said, but Mark puts more emphasis on what Jesus did. We see Jesus doing more than saying. We see Jesus healing more than teaching. We see Jesus giving commands more than giving parables. And so Mark is being very intentional about the way he's writing his gospel. And so in Matthew, you have Jesus being presented as a king, but in Mark, you have Jesus being presented as a servant. Next up, we have the book of Luke. Now, Luke is also a unique book because Luke is not a Jew. Luke is a Gentile. Specifically, Luke is a Greek. Luke was probably the most educated out of all the gospel authors. He was a physician. He was a doctor. There's even times in Scripture he's referred to as a beloved physician. He was a travel companion of Paul and traveled with the Apostle Paul on his different missionary journeys. And he's considered to be a very respected historian in the biblical context. And Luke is writing his gospel, again, very intentional because he's presenting Jesus in a certain way because of his target audience. Unlike Matthew presenting Jesus to the Jews or Mark presenting Jesus to the Romans, Luke is presenting Jesus to the Greeks. Luke addresses his gospel to a man named Theophilus. Now, Theophilus could be an individual, but it could also mean something different because the word Theophilus or the name Theophilus means beloved of God. So scholars believe he could be addressing it to an individual named Theophilus, or he could be speaking symbolically that he's writing his gospel to all of the Greeks who are beloved of God. But the Greek culture in the time of Jesus were very intellectual. They were very humanistic and they were very philosophical. And so Luke begins to write, and he does not present Jesus as a king. He does not present Jesus as a servant. He presents Jesus as the perfect man, the perfect human being. And when Luke begins to trace the lineage of Jesus Christ, he doesn't trace the lineage back and put emphasis on King David, but he traces lineage all the way back to Adam because he's wanting to make a mental note in the audience's mind that Jesus was the perfect man. And even Apostle Paul said that Jesus was the second Adam or the second man born from God. And because Luke is presenting Jesus as the perfect man, we can find the story of Jesus' birth, or what we call the Christmas story, in more detail in the book of Luke than any other book. And all throughout the book, Luke will use the term Son of Man to describe Jesus, because he's wanting to present him as a man. He's wanting to present him as human. You'll find different times when Jesus was hungry, or Jesus was tired, or Jesus was asleep, or Jesus wept, right? Jesus cried. He's being presented as a human being. And also something unique about the book of Luke, there's more medical details listed in the book of Luke when it's describing the miracles. So Matthew puts emphasis on what Jesus said, Mark puts emphasis on what Jesus did, and Luke puts emphasis on the humanity of Jesus. Next up, we have the book of John. Now, something interesting about the book of John is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what's known as the synoptic gospels. And the word synoptic simply means to be similar. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar, and they tell a lot of the stories, they tell a lot of the same miracles, they tell a lot of the same parables. But John is unique in the fact that John tells stories that no other gospel tells. For example, in John chapter 3, it tells a story of a conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus about being born again. There's no other record of that in the other Gospels. And also in John chapter 4, it tells a story of Jesus meeting a woman at the well in a conversation that they had. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't record that conversation. And so John is a unique book because John is not presenting Jesus any other way than that the other books were presenting Jesus. And this is because of John's unique target audience. John's target audience is different because he's not writing to the Jews, and he's not writing to the Greeks, and he's not even writing to the Romans. But John's target audience is to the church. So John is writing to the church, and he's wanting to present Jesus in a certain way to the church. You see, because it's believed that this was the last of the 4 Gospels written, and it's believed that John was at the end of his lifespan when he wrote the Gospel of John. If you study John's life, you'll find that John was one of the 12 disciples, but it's believed that he was the youngest out of the 12. And it's also believed that he probably had the closest relationship out of all the 12 disciples to Jesus Christ. And Jesus even referred to him as John the Beloved. Because John was the youngest, John lived the longest lifespan, and it's believed he was the last of the 12 disciples to die. So John saw a lot of church history take place in his lifespan, and he lived long enough to see false doctrines and false teachings begin to creep into the church about who Jesus was. And so it's believed that John writes his gospel at the end of his life when he's in old age because he's wanting to reaffirm and reestablish to the church who Jesus was. That Jesus was not just a good man. Jesus was not just a good teacher. He was not just one of the prophets, but Jesus was in fact so much more. So when John goes to trace Jesus' lineage, he doesn't trace his lineage back and put emphasis on King David like Matthew does. He doesn't trace his lineage back to Adam and put emphasis on Jesus being a man like Luke does. But he starts his book off entirely different and traces Jesus' lineage all the way back to creation. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." In verse 14, he says, "The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us." Jesus' lineage really started before time began because Jesus is not just a man, but Jesus is in fact God. So he doesn't draw attention to what Jesus said like Matthew, and he doesn't draw attention to what Jesus did like Mark, but he draws attention to who Jesus was. Because that's all what that book is about. It's not what Jesus said, not what Jesus did, but who was Jesus. And he points back to the identity, the character, the nature of Jesus Christ. And he doesn't even put emphasis on Jesus' humanity like Luke does, but he puts emphasis on Jesus' divinity. That Jesus was not just the Son of Man, but Jesus was the Son of God. So John is presenting Jesus as God, and not just any God, but the same God of the Old Testament, the I am that I am. And that's why in the book of John, you'll find something called the I am statements. Over and over and over again, Jesus makes I am statements. He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the bread and the life. I am the door. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the living water. Before Abraham was, I am." And even when the guards came to arrest him, Jesus said, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "We're looking for the Christ." And Jesus replies, "I am," with such power and authority that all the guards fell back on their backs, because John is presenting Jesus as the I am. And in the book of John, Jesus does teach on subjects, but John takes his teachings a step further, because Jesus goes on to say, "I taught you this to reveal who I am to you." He documents the miracles, but then takes it a step further in saying why Jesus did those miracles. For example, Jesus feeds the 5,000, right? With 2 fishes and 5 loaves of bread. And the other Gospels stop there. John takes it a step further and says the reason why Jesus fed the 5,000 with the bread, in order to reveal that Jesus was the bread of life. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, but why? To reveal that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Jesus speaks to a woman at a well drawing water. Why? To reveal that He is the living water. Because it all points back to not what Jesus is saying, not what Jesus is doing, but who Jesus was, the character, the identity, the makeup of who Jesus was. Because John did not want the church to lose sight of who Jesus was. That Jesus was not just the Son of Man. Jesus was not just a promised king. Jesus was not just a good teacher or a prophet. He was not just a servant, but Jesus was God. And He should be worshiped as God. And He should be viewed as God. It's so neat that it's almost like the entirety of John's gospel seems to climax in John chapter 20 and verse 28. Jesus reveals Himself to Thomas, and He says, "Thomas, touch my wounds in my sides, touch my nail-scarred hands, and let it prove to you that I'm alive." And Thomas touches the wounds in his sides and in his hands, and then all of a sudden Thomas falls down and cries out, "My Lord and my God." Because that's the whole point of the book of John, is he's wanting to present Jesus as God. And so we have Matthew presents Jesus as a king and as the Christ, and we have Mark that presents Jesus as a servant, and we have Luke that presents Jesus as the Son of Man, and we have John that presents Jesus as the Son of God. And all 4 of these books go together in perfect harmony to present Jesus in different ways, so we can have not just a snapshot of who He was, but we can see the whole full picture of who Jesus was. It's a beautiful study, and it's one I get very excited talking about, and I encourage you to study more. And if you want to see something really neat, in Revelation chapter 4 and verse 7, John sees a vision of the heavenly throne room, and around the throne of God, he sees 4 beasts: a lion, an oxen, a man, and an eagle. And what's so cool about the Word of God is that Matthew is presenting Jesus as a king or as a lion. Mark is presenting Jesus as a servant, a hard worker, or an ox. Luke is presenting Jesus as a man. And John is presenting Jesus as God, ones whose ways are higher than our ways and thoughts are higher than our thoughts, or as an eagle that soars high above the earth. So the Bible is a beautiful thing. Everything meshes together, everything fits together perfectly, and the Gospels are no exception. All right, so that's been the 4 Gospels like you've never seen them. I hope you learned something, and I hope it inspires you and sparks something in you to go and begin to study this subject more on your own. And if this is a subject that you're really interested in, I can't recommend enough a book called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. This would be an awesome book if you want to dive more into this subject and explaining exactly why we know that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are dependable, are reliable, and are trustworthy, and are accurate historical documents of the life and death of Jesus Christ. Until next time, this has been Spencer, and I'm a lifelong disciple of Jesus Christ. And if I can ever do anything to help you, if you have any questions about anything we discussed or covered in this lesson, feel free to reach out to me or to the Anchor, and let's progress together as we choose to follow after Jesus Christ.